What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I broke every family rule and won, and I did it without raising my voice, without slamming doors, and without letting them spin me into the same old role they always thought I would never escape. At dinner, with the plates barely settled and the chatter about Caleb's perfect new housewarming filling the table, my mom leaned across with that smile that is less a sign of joy and more a sign of performance, and she asked me, in front of everyone, when I would finally have mine, as if I was behind, as if I was somehow failing to keep up with the milestones they all measured life by. And I answered calmly, almost gently, I already did, last year. You didn't make the list. She froze, the table went silent, and for once I did not feel smaller, I felt taller, because I had said the truth that had been pressing on my chest for years, and I had said it without apology. To understand why that sentence landed like a grenade, you need to understand how many years I had played the family accountant, the emergency fund, the silent sponsor of everyone else's lives, while they gave my efforts the same weight as background noise. It started small, the way these things always do. Caleb's first apartment? He was 21, broke, and my parents insisted that I help with the deposit because I was the one with a stable job. I put down the money and even set up the utilities in my name, thinking it was temporary, thinking it would show them I was dependable, but of course it became permanent. Thanksgiving after Thanksgiving, Christmas after Christmas, birthdays, showers, endless events that were supposed to be about togetherness always came with the same assumption that I would quietly cover whatever was short, and if I ever dared to hesitate, I was told not to make things harder. I cannot even tell you the number of times I bought gifts that were relabeled as from the family, while Caleb's name got the loud thank yous, and my contribution was treated like it simply didn't matter. Even groceries for holiday dinners were half-stocked from my card, yet I never once heard my name when my mom praised the spread to her friends. I kept thinking it would change, that one day they would notice, but the pattern only deepened, and it wasn't just money, it was also energy, attention, time, every resource that could be extracted, parceled out to them without acknowledgement. So when I got my own place last year, a tiny but fully mine apartment with the papers signed in my name alone, I had a choice to make. I could invite them, knowing exactly how it would go, my mom comparing square footage to Caleb's house, my brother treating it like a practice run for when he really made it big, and everyone else waiting for me to foot the bill for food and drinks. Or I could protect my peace and build my own circle, one that wasn't about roles or pecking orders, but about actual support. I chose the second option, and it turned out to be the most freeing decision of my life. That night, the real housewarming was small, but it was genuine. A handful of friends, no performance, no one measuring me against my brother, no one keeping score except me, and for once the scoreboard was clear. This was my place, my rules, my beginning. We laughed, we ate, we talked like equals, and I realized I had been starving for that kind of space. I didn't invite my family because it wasn't about excluding them out of spite. It was about including only the people who didn't see me as a utility, and that distinction mattered more than I had allowed myself to admit. So when Mom asked me at dinner about my housewarming, she thought she was being clever, prodding me in front of everyone, reinforcing the script where I was always the one catching up, the one still not measuring up. She wanted the laugh, the smirk, the sympathy vote. But instead I gave her the line that flipped the script completely. I already had mine, last year, and you didn't make the list. I said it with the same tone they had always used on me, the calm, matter-of-fact dismissal that says everything without raising volume. And in that instant, the dynamic shifted. I had not planned to reveal it this way, but once the words were out, I felt a kind of clarity I had never felt before. I saw her eyes flicker with confusion, then calculation, then something closer to fear, because she realized I had not only acted without her permission, but also without her knowledge, and she was not the gatekeeper of my milestones anymore. Caleb tried to jump in with a joke, but even he went quiet when I pulled a thin folder from my bag and slid it across the table. Inside was a simple sheet, a breakdown of every automatic payment I had canceled over the last year, each one tied to some family expense they had quietly expected me to shoulder forever. Gas, utilities, subscriptions, deposits, all of it ending on dates that told a story clearer than any argument ever could. I didn't need to say a word about why. The numbers spoke for me. Each line was another cut cord, another invisible leash broken, another role returned to its rightful owner. It was not about revenge for me, it was about truth, and once truth was on paper, no one could pretend they didn't know. Mom smiled, that brittle smile of hers, and said, "Sweetheart, you wouldn't have had to pay if you didn't make things so difficult." She thought she had won the moment back, but I was already past that kind of manipulation. I leaned back and asked her one question that I had never dared before. "Do you know your true worth?" And I let the silence stretch, because I knew exactly what I meant, and I knew it landed. That was only the first move, and if she thought I was bluffing, she was about to learn how wrong she was. When I woke up the next morning after that dinner, with my phone stacked with messages that ranged from brittle politeness to open blame, I realized that if I wanted this to go differently than every other family flare-up, I could not fall into the trap of arguing feelings or tone or respect, because those were the places where my mother could spin and my brother could charm. So I had to live in the one territory where their stories had the least oxygen, which was the territory of receipts. Records and dates that did not care about who sounded more wounded in a group chat or who could call more relatives to gather sympathy, because paper has no loyalty except to the truth, and the truth, in this case, was that I had spent years underwriting their comfort while they made jokes about my standards and labeled me too much every time I asked for a basic boundary. I started with the group chat because that was where Brittany had posted the glossy photos from Caleb's housewarming, and while everyone cheered the coffee machine and the smart vacuum and the stainless mixer that she called wedding magic, I saw, in one sweep of the album, a museum of items I had purchased during those years when I thought generosity would eventually unlock equality, and I felt that old burn in my chest, not rage, not grief, just the realization that I had given too much narrative control to people who loved the performance more than the gratitude, so I opened a private folder on my laptop and began the slow, careful work of matching each object to a transaction, each transaction to a date, and each date to a short caption that used only one kind of language, which was factual, and I told myself, out loud, that I would not weaponize this, I would simply own it. Mrs. Nguyen's voice from last year, when I closed on my lease, floated back to me as I worked, because she had said, with the kind of calm that comes only from decades of watching people fight over money and then pretend they were fighting about respect, that if your name is on a thing, then you treat it as yours with responsibility and clarity, and if your name is not on it, then you let it go and save your energy. And I realized the trap I had been in was the space between those rules, which is where families bury daughters who know how to make things happen. So I pulled statements, warranty registrations, and order confirmations, and I made a clean album with masked card numbers and full product serials. And I looked up which items were legally registered to me and therefore serviceable only by me, and I began the tedious, patient process of updating addresses where allowed and scheduling routine service calls for the portable items that had followed Caleb into his shiny new life as if they were communal property rather than gifts I had bought under pressure. I did not gloat, I did not post, I did not lecture, because the point was not to embarrass anyone. The point was to show myself that I could live in alignment with my own rules. And the first time I opened a manufacturer's portal and saw my name as the sole owner of something that had been paraded in Brittany's video as if it had materialized out of thin air, I felt a click inside, a small but decisive shift. Like a lock finally turned, and even though I knew how this would be painted by the people who love drama more than accountability, I also knew that I had given them the consequence months earlier when I turned off the autopays, so none of this was a surprise to anyone who cared to read the room. By the time the doorbell rang at Caleb's house and a polite technician arrived to pick up the mixer for routine service under my warranty, I had already organized the rest. A coffee machine due for descaling and part replacement at my address, a vacuum battery recall that required owner identification, an appliance extended plan that transferred to me by default since I was the purchaser, and when Brittany started recording the arrival like it was reality television, I kept my tone steady on. the phone and told the technician that if anyone gave him trouble he could cancel and I would reschedule directly, because this was not a scene to be played for online points. This was a boundary moving in silence, and boundaries do not explain themselves. They simply exist. Of course the messages came fast, a new flurry that accused me of theft and betrayal and pettiness, and I copied one reply to all of them, a single paragraph that said the items under service were purchased by me, registered to me, and currently being maintained at my cost, that no one was being charged or punished, and that if they wanted replacements they could use their registry discounts or their homeowner funds, and I ended the paragraph with a line that was colder than I usually allow myself to be, but necessary to say, I am not the family warehouse, and I am not the story you tell when you need a villain. Caleb called and tried the familiar tone, the soft plea for understanding wrapped in a joke about me loving control, and I told him that what I loved now was fairness, and that fairness looked like him buying his own gadgets if he wanted to show them off at parties. And I reminded him, not as a threat but as a calendar fact, that there were other contracts in the world with both our names on them, and that my patience had a lifespan that was measured in years and had finally expired, which meant I would be moving through those contracts with the same careful steps I had taken with the warranties, and he went quiet, because even he could hear what I was saying under the words. And then my phone vibrated with a voicemail from Mom, the kind that starts with a long sigh and a tremble that used to twist my stomach, where she said she could not believe I would humiliate the family like this over kitchen toys, and that she hoped I was done because she did not want to imagine what would happen if I took this energy somewhere serious. And as I listened, I felt the old reflex rise, the one that wants to fix everything so she will stop sounding disappointed. But I let it pass. And I stared at the list I had made for myself after the dinner, the one titled Terms and Conditions, and I knew, with a steadiness that felt like standing on bedrock, that the next move had nothing to do with housewares and everything to do with liability and signatures, and the car that had my name stuck to it like a magnet. So I opened the folder from the credit counselor, and I drafted the notice that would start the process I had warned them about months ago, and just before I hit send, my screen lit again with Caleb's text, for words that told me he finally understood that I was serious. Please do not do it, and I answered, you had every chance, and pressed send anyway. When I finally reached the point where the warranties and receipts were no longer enough to contain the years of imbalance, I turned to the single contract that had haunted me for almost half a decade. The one that tied my financial reputation directly to Caleb's carelessness. The car loan I had co-signed because my mother insisted it was just a temporary gesture of support, and because at the time I still believed that helping him build credit would eventually free me from being the default solution for every crisis. Yet what it really did was chain my future to his mistakes in a way that quietly drained my confidence every time I checked my credit score and saw the dents his late payments had carved into my name. It is difficult to explain to anyone who has never lived it just how humiliating it feels to know that you earn your own salary, pay your bills on time, keep your promises, yet a number that dictates where you can live and what you can borrow is dragged down because someone else treated deadlines like suggestions and thought consequences were negotiable. And it is worse when that someone is the golden child whose every stumble is reframed as a learning experience, while your cautiousness is reframed as coldness. Months earlier, after another cycle of late notices and apologies that did not match the size of the damage, I had gone to a credit counselor who explained, with a clarity that felt like oxygen after years of fog, that I had two choices if Caleb would not refinance. I could either force him to take the loan into his own name, or I could trigger the voluntary termination clause, which would end my liability completely, even if it meant the car would be repossessed if he could not keep up a loan. At the time I filed the information away, thinking maybe it was too drastic, thinking maybe he would surprise me, but when the mixer and the vacuum and the endless text threads showed me just how little he had grown, I knew that waiting was only prolonging my own captivity, so I pulled out the folder, filled in the notice, and for the first time I signed my name not as someone's guarantor, but as someone withdrawing consent. The dealership confirmed quickly, almost clinically, that without my signature the renewal would stall, and that Caleb would need to provide proof of income and independent credit within 30 days, or else the vehicle would revert to his sole liability. And when he called me, half panicked and half indignant, asking how I could sabotage him like this when he needed the car for work, I reminded him that I had given him years of cushion and months of warning, and that the contract was never supposed to be a lifetime subscription to my stability. It was a bridge he was meant to cross on his own, but instead he had pitched a tent in the middle of it and called it home, and I was simply reclaiming the road. At almost the same time, I went through my mother's paperwork too, because for years I had been listed as her emergency contact, the person the hospital would call, the one her insurance defaulted to, and while on the surface it looks like a roll of honor, in practice it was a trap, because every time she had a minor procedure, every time she skipped a bill and a provider came looking for confirmation, it was me who had to sign, to mediate, to fix, and she used that fact like leverage, reminding me that if I loved her, I would not walk away, yet never once acknowledging that love does not have to be proven by tethering yourself legally to someone who cannot see your value unless it is written in what you provide. So I drafted letters to her providers too, politely but firmly removing myself from every proxy role, and I sent copies to her directly, so there would be no illusion, no chance for her to pretend she had not been told. The fallout was immediate and predictable. Caleb accused me of destroying his life, though the truth was that all I had done was hand him back the responsibility that had been his from the beginning. My mother left me a voicemail that was more performance than plea, her voice trembling as she said, "If something happens to me, you will regret this forever," as though regret was a currency she could use to buy my compliance. And for a moment, I felt the old reflex, the almost physical urge to undo what I had done just so the weight of guilt would lift, but then I remembered that regret only works on people who still believe they are responsible for everyone else's outcomes, and I no longer believed that was my role. What surprised me most was not their anger, but the silence that followed it, because once the notices were filed and the contracts shifted, there was nothing left to negotiate, no leverage, no half-truths. No emotional appeals that could override a legal document with my signature removed, and I realized how much of my exhaustion over the years had come from endless arguments in circles, where feelings were weaponized and memories rewritten, while paperwork sat ignored in drawers. The moment I chose the paper over the performance, everything became quieter, and in that quiet I could finally hear myself think. Still, I knew that the next battlefield would not be money or contracts, but something more slippery and insidious, the narrative. Because if there is one thing my mother has always known how to do better than anyone else, it is to control the story of what happened, to present herself as the long-suffering parent and me as the ungrateful daughter, and Caleb as the charming dreamer who just needs one more break. She would not let the story of the car or the insurance or the housewarming sit as evidence of her negligence. She would spin it until I was the villain, and in families like mine, reputation is as much a weapon as money. That was why, even as I mailed the last of the letters, I began preparing for the next round, not by sharpening arguments, but by collecting the kind of evidence that could not be erased with a smile or rewritten with a sigh. I gathered screenshots, timelines, payment histories, texts that showed patterns stretching back years, and I organized them not for drama, not for revenge, but for clarity, because the day would come when I would need to reclaim the narrative not just for myself, but for anyone who would listen, and I wanted to be ready. And as I set the last folder in order, my phone buzzed with a message from my father, brief and heavy. "She's telling people you abandoned us. Be careful." I stared at the words and realized he was right. The narrative war had already started, and if I didn't step into it with the same calm I had brought to the contracts, I would lose the truth forever. It was time to become my own narrator. When the letters were mailed and the dealership confirmed that my signature had been withdrawn, I thought there might be a lull, a quiet stretch where the storm would finally die down. But what I underestimated was my mother's ability to weaponize silence by filling it with her own narrative, because almost overnight I began hearing from cousins, aunts, and even an old neighbor that she was painting me as the ungrateful daughter who had turned her back on the family, who had chosen money over love, who had humiliated them all over petty disputes, and while none of these people had been in the room when the years of exploitation were happening, they now felt entitled to call me, some offering pity, others anger. All of them shaped by her version of events, and I knew then that my next battle was not about contracts or finances, but about the story itself, because if I let her version dominate, then every careful move I had made would be swallowed up in the old caricature of me as too much. I reminded myself of something Maya had once said during one of our long talks over coffee, that reputations are fragile only when you let other people hold the pen, and if you want to stop bleeding credibility, you have to start writing your own account. Not in defensive rants or emotional outbursts, but in calm, factual records that no one can distort. So that became my project for the next week. I pulled together screenshots of text messages where my mother had dismissed me with a quick, "Stop being dramatic," after I had asked for a little acknowledgement. I collected the bank records that showed how many utilities, deposits, and holiday expenses had run through my accounts. I gathered copies of conversations where I was pressured into paying, just this once, which always became a cycle. And I arranged them in a timeline that did not shout or accuse, but simply said, "This is what happened, these are the dates, this is the proof." For years I had been told that my memory was faulty, that I exaggerated, that I twisted things, and having this documentation in front of me was not just about defending myself to others, it was about undoing that gaslighting in my own mind. About proving to myself that I had not been imagining the imbalance, that it really had been that lopsided, and that I had every right to stop carrying the weight. It was strange how empowering it felt to see it all laid out, not as a vague feeling of being used, but as a series of undeniable facts, each one a small victory against the story she was now spreading. When I was finished, I did not blast it into the group chat, because that would have been a performance as shallow as hers, and I did not post it on social media, because I was not interested in making my pain into entertainment. Instead, I chose the people who mattered most to me, the handful of relatives and old family friends whose opinions could not be swayed by gossip once they saw the truth, and I sent them the timeline with a simple note. I want you to see what no one has ever been willing to say out loud. The responses came slowly but steadily, and while some stayed neutral, others admitted that they had suspected all along, that the patterns had been visible even from the outside, and one aunt even apologized for not speaking up sooner, saying she had believed my mother's polished version because it was easier than confronting the ugliness underneath. But the most powerful thing I shared was not the receipts or the texts. It was a single photograph from my quiet housewarming the year before, the one where Maya held a small cake with my name on it, and I stood beside her, laughing without tension, surrounded by people who were not taking advantage of me but celebrating me, and I sent that photo as proof that happiness outside the family story was possible, that I had already lived a version of my life that was lighter and freer, and that the caricature of me as bitter and alone was just another lie. It wasn't grand, it wasn't staged, it was real, and I think that photo did more to dismantle her narrative than all the spreadsheets combined, because it showed something she could never counterfeit, genuine joy that did not require her permission. The group chat, however, was a different arena. My mother had been seeding comments for weeks, little jabs about loyalty, about family, about how some people cared only for themselves, and Caleb and Brittany had chimed in with their polished couple act, agreeing just enough to keep the spotlight off them. For a long time I stayed quiet, not wanting to add fuel, but after sending out my timeline privately, I decided it was time to close the public loop, not with evidence, not with rants, but with boundaries, so I typed a short message, 3 sentences long. That said, I would no longer be part of any financial arrangements with family members, that I would not respond to requests framed as emergencies, and that I expected the group chat to stop being used as a platform for ridicule or scapegoating. Then I locked the message so replies were disabled, and I stepped back. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical, because for once they could not turn my words into another round of arguments. Caleb tried calling, but I did not answer. Brittany posted a vague quote about betrayal, but I ignored it. My mother sent a single line privately, "So you're cutting us off for good," and I let it sit unanswered, because I had already said what needed to be said, and repeating myself would only weaken the point. It was late that night when my father called, his voice low and tired, telling me that my mother was talking about changing the will, about erasing me as punishment, as if money I had never asked for could suddenly become a weapon of control. I listened quietly, and then he said something that stopped me cold. "She's furious, because you changed something too, didn't you?" I could hear in his tone that he suspected I had made my own moves, that my calm was not just defiance, but strategy, and he asked, "What did you change?" I didn't answer him right away, because the truth was that I had been preparing for this moment for months, quietly, meticulously, in ways they had not noticed, and the real answer would come soon enough. Because the next stage was not about contracts or receipts or even narratives whispered at family dinners. It was about the final move I had kept in reserve, the one that would end every argument and prove once and for all that I was no longer playing their game, and as I hung up the phone I knew the moment had come to show them exactly what I meant. The dinner where I finally said the words that split everything open had felt like a climax at the time, yet in truth it was only the prelude to the decision I had been carrying for months, the one that would close the circle and leave no room for negotiation. Because as much as I had taken back with the cancelled payments, the repossessed warranties, and the removed signatures, the most important step was not just cutting ties to the old burdens, but building something that was entirely mine. With rules they could not bend and with proof that my life was not a half measure compared to Caleb's, but a whole structure I had created without their help and without their approval. When my father asked me on the phone what I had changed, what I had been preparing all this time, I almost told him, but I stopped myself, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I wanted them to learn in real time that I was capable of writing my own story, and that for once the ending would not belong to them. The truth was that the night I had hosted my real housewarming, the one they were never invited to, I had not only celebrated with friends, but also made myself a promise, and I had even written it down in a short note I kept folded in my desk drawer. Never beg for love you have to purchase, never surrender peace for approval, and never carry someone else's weight if they treat your strength as a given. That night, Maya had asked me if I thought my family would ever change, and I told her that even if they didn't, I still would, and that was the point, because the only way to break the cycle was to stop measuring myself by their reactions. And from that note grew the plan that I was now ready to reveal. When I walked back into their house for what would be the final dinner, I was calm, not because I expected reconciliation, but because I had brought with me the last folder, slim, neatly labeled, containing documents that would close the loop forever. The evening began like all the others, with my mother trying to steer the conversation toward appearances, praising Caleb's new promotions, listing Brittany's networking successes, sprinkling small jabs about how some people choose selfishness over family. And I let her run the script until she finally circled back to me, asking in that bright but cutting tone if I was ready yet to grow up and host a real housewarming, one that the family could attend, and I looked straight at her and said, "I already did, you just weren't on the list," repeating the line that had silenced her once before, but this time I added, "and tonight you'll understand why." I slid the folder across the table and told them that inside were 3 letters. The first was addressed to my mother and Caleb, formally notifying them that from this point forward, any financial requests, emergencies, or obligations involving my name must be directed through an attorney, and that I would no longer respond to late-night calls, frantic texts, or guilt-laden appeals, because communication would now be filtered through official channels where facts, not emotions, determined outcomes. The second was a confirmation of closure, stating clearly that every payment, every deposit, every purchase I had made over the years was considered a gift, irrevocable and non-repayable, and that I released them from any future attempts to frame my generosity as leverage, because I wanted no money back, only my freedom, and I was not leaving any cracks they could later wedge into arguments about debts or obligations. The third was the one that mattered most, the one that I had funded. Quietly each month since I canceled the last autopay, the creation of a small scholarship in our grandmother's name, earmarked for first-generation students who were building their lives without family resources. Because if my money was no longer going to be drained by thankless relatives, it would instead go to strangers who actually needed and valued it, and by structuring it this way, I turned every accusation of stinginess on its head, proving that generosity was still at the core of who I was, just no longer generosity they could exploit. My mother's face went pale as she read, not because the letters were cruel, but because they were final. Because for the first time she realized that she had no counter-narrative strong enough to undo a notarized statement and no emotional performance dramatic enough to erase the fact that I had already reallocated what she once considered her leverage. Caleb tried to laugh it off, to make a joke about me becoming a lawyer in secret, but the joke fell flat, and when he saw no one smile, he leaned back, sulking in a way that only highlighted just how much of his life had depended on others picking up after him. I stood, thanked them for dinner, and told them plainly that this was the last time I would be sitting at a table where respect was conditional and acknowledgement was rationed. I left my copy of the letter on the table, not as a threat but as a boundary, and I walked to the door without looking back, because I knew if I did, I might see the old hooks in their faces, the ones that had always reeled me back in, and I was determined never to be caught again. As I stepped outside, my phone buzzed with a text from my father, short and hesitant. I read your letter. I want to talk, man to adult. And for the first time, I smiled, not because everything was healed, but because I understood that even in the ruins of old roles, something new could grow, not a return to the past, but a different kind of honesty. I typed back, then talk to me like one, and with that I walked away, not triumphant in the cinematic sense, but steady, resolved, and fully certain that I had finally moved into my own life, one where I no longer needed their approval to define my worth, and one where the only housewarming that mattered had already happened the night I chose myself.